Hello, and welcome to Pride and Prejudice and Podcasts. I'm one of your hosts, Nat Elmorel.
I'm LJ Halfyard.
And I'm Kurt Halfyard.
And when we last left Elizabeth Bennet, she had just toured the luxurious estate of Mr. Darcy, Pembury, and in one of my favorite freeze frames, largely because I can't recall the other ones prior to that, we get to see Elizabeth looking back longingly at Pembury. And I think all of us collectively said on the last episode that we couldn't wait to watch episodes 5 and 6 immediately afterwards. Unfortunately, yeah, we had to wait a little bit before we could get to that, but we are in the home stretch, and with episode 5, well, there's not too much, I guess, overall that happens in this episode.
I completely, I agree. I agree, and Laura Jane just flipped her lid. A lot happens plot-wise, but I don't think a lot happens in the way you get insight to characters. Maybe you have a different take?
I would say a little the opposite. I don't think too much happens plot-wise outside of just one big development that kind of sets everything toward the end in motion.
Okay, I'll admit there's a lot of more looks back and forth in this episode, but I think there's nothing like a tragedy or a mishap to really let people see who you are. So I think there's a lot more, because of this event, there's a lot more that you get to see, like the other characters really shine or they really come out. So for example, Mr. Collins, right? He really shines in this episode.
Well, yeah. Well, and the conflict you're talking about is the scandalous Lydia running off with Wickham without
Mr.
any
Wickham.
marriage or anything, and they don't even tell anyone where they're going. They kind of mislead people, and that's kind of the core of this episode. Although it does start with the first visit to Pemberley happens before the letters come. There is a little bit of a Mr. Darcy, and the Bingleys are back.
Yep.
And Elizabeth gets to, tinkle the ivories a bit on the piano with Georgina. Or do they meet at the pub first? Or is that in between?
Darcy goes to the inn, if that's what you mean, to introduce Georgiana, like he asked that he could do in number 4. And then Bingley comes in as well.
That's right. And so we get to actually, it's kind of interesting, we get to replay when Jane is sick early on. We get to kind of replay that configuration now at Pemberley instead of Netherfield.
Yes.
And we get to watch, I think it's much more clear now because Darcy won't take his eyes off of Elizabeth in her time spent there. And she's clearly does well with his sister. And now you see the haughty Bingley sisters, although the one sister's husband is still drunk on the couch. He spends the whole episode drunk on the couch. But they seem belittled. Even the way they're framed in this episode on the couch, they do not seem like the all-powerful, coming in rich people. Like Bingley's money is tiny compared to Darcy's money, so they're like kind of huddled on the couch.
I wonder if that's just a framing or a filming technique. You'll obviously let me know, because at Netherfield, you're right, they seem like it was
they're like almost like a jury.
There.
Yeah.
But now, and maybe they're just trying to show the grandeur of Pemberley, but it seemed a lot more open, spacious.
Well, and they're bless you, and they are kind of on the edge of the frame, looking down on everything in Netherfield, and right here they're kind of stuck on the couch in the middle, in between the piano and the thing.
You're talking about that scene. Okay.
Yeah. It's a nice little bit of framing. And Caroline Bingley is now pretty much irrelevant. Like the Darcy dismissal is pretty in full force here when he just gets up and walks away from her.
Right. And I commented about that. Remember in a previous episode, Elizabeth states, isn't incivility the most obvious sign of affection? And so here, Caroline says something to Mr. Darcy, and he's, what? And then just gets up and leaves.
Oh, meaning that's the moment when he's totally caught
Basically,
up in Elizabeth, and he's he's not even being mannerly, which is funny because I feel the last episode Darcy spent a lot of time, kind of focusing his powers of good manners to make a good impression, but here he's done with Miss Bingley.
Yeah.
But I guess going to the crux of the matter. The key thing in this episode, unless you have anything to add on that, Nat.
Excuse me. No, just when you mentioned the framing, it did get me thinking that this series really does a great job of incorporating kind of both the human elements and combining that with the actual settings. The one of the shots that we'll get to in episode 6 is with Catherine de Bourgh and her daughter just sitting in that huge living room or parlor of her
by themselves.
Yeah, just very, very empty. And just like the placement of people across the ballroom, and we talked a bit about the parade in front of the fireplace in the prior episode. I think the camera does kind of focus a little bit on, again, the reactions, because that's sort of the meat of the series, but it does do a really, really good job of kind of integrating them with the sets, and part of that is blocking, but I think also just the camera work itself, or just like you said, the framing.
Now, Joe Wright made the film version in the early 2000s, and I'm not as familiar with it as this one to understand whether, because Wright is very good at composition and controlling elements in the frame, but it does make me pine for what, on so many levels, what a David Fincher version of Pride and Prejudice would look like, because that director is so good with people and architecture, and clearly compared to previous versions of Pride and Prejudice where they didn't have the budgets or the exteriors or the larger sets, this one can do more movie things in 1995. I'd like to see what the next iteration of. Obviously, that's not the whole element of it, but it's a big element, and these things play into so many other things.
Well, and so many people are defined by their estates or the lodgings that they take, and it is like a visual cue too, that you can identify someone's status by just their living quarters. Like when Darcy and Georgina go to the inn, like immediately they're out of their element, they're out of place, and that's not simply in the reaction. That's also just if it's excessively dark, if there's a few objects of art, if there is very lush or huge paintings. I think they do a really, really good job of conveying a lot of information just in their set design.
Yeah, even Georgina's piano, she's kind of just coming into her own as on the verge of coming out into society, and she's like, oh yeah, I just got this piano, the idea that it's kind of a new object and it's a new thing, but she can play it, but she's tentative and shy.
But yes, Lydia, which I think we were going to originally get to.
Yeah, and we get it with letters. So again, Pride and Prejudice is a lovely ode to correspondence, and here there's this quirk of Jane failing to handwrite the address very well. So you get it's an interesting kind of time travel-y thing to be able to get all the exposition in one spot due to an error in the post. So Elizabeth gets 2 letters that are presumably separated by a few days, but she gets to read them all at once, and she gets kind of everything. And they handle that by literally just having her read the letters. They do a couple visual flashbacks, but for the most part, she's just reading the letters, right? Mm-hmm. And inside the letters, you have the whole sordid affair of the 15-year-old running off with the dashing soldier into, I guess, would not be a major scandal if the Bennets weren't of higher station.
It still would be.
You think it still would be in that era? If they were just peasants?
Being unchaperoned?
Again, I feel that's the aristocracy. I feel Britain in the lower classes was body and anything goes. I feel that's only the
I see.
aristocracy. Well, that's kind of a lot of the logistics of this episode. Is first you get in the letters that Mr. Bennet is finally left his library. God forbid.
Yeah.
Mr. Bennet has left his library. You know it's serious when. And trying to find, whether they've gone off to Scotland, whether they're hiding in London, like what the deal is. You get this odd flash sideways to Wickham and Lydia just hanging out in a London studio apartment.
That's part of the letters, though, is it?
No, it's not part of the letters, but you do get to see their once Darcy springs into action, you get to see their living quarters of where they are, kind of in hiding. It's very bizarre. They ran off, presumably because the sex was good, and because
you know what? Funny you should mention that, because it wasn't till about a year or two ago when I got that Pride and Prejudice, the Wanton edition, that I actually thought, maybe that's really what they were doing.
Tawdry? Of course it was. What else was?
I just thought he just wanted company.
Lydia was a well-endowed, able-bodied 15-year-old horn dog.
Okay.
That ran off for the good lay, and Wickham was like, "Fine, let's go. I'm free. I normally do this with the ladies of the night at the various gambling establishments I hang out with. Now he's got, although I think the way they frame it like that, they're always in bed when they're talking.
In the video, I'm sorry, in the series, yes, but not in the book,
I think it's there. I think it's there.
I don't know. Well, I was thinking the title should be Pride and Prejudice and Parenting, but you're right. I think your title is much better.
Okay, so she flips out. Lizzie, this is the most upset. Like, there's always conflict in Pride and Prejudice. People get upset about everything. I mean, if you have a pie graph of all the upsetness, Mrs. Bennet actually gets half, and then the other half is divided between all the other characters. But Lizzie she's deeply, profoundly upset by this. I'm surprised, actually, that she's this upset. But I guess it's partly because she cares for her sister a wee bit. It's partly because the whole reputation, which has been on the brink since the first balls at Netherfield, is going to come crashing down. And she knows with the Darcy, Wickham, and everything else that it's like Lydia's impulsive libido is going to wreck her chances of patching back together with Darcy after things are starting to go well. And just as she's totally thinking that, Darcy rushes into the room, somewhat unannounced, right? Like he's just coming by for a casual visit. And no, the gardeners, she decides to stay back and read the letters.
I think what it is,
the gardeners are gone.
I think why he comes in, because you see him after that conversation with Caroline the night before where he walked off. So I think this is he's like, I got to go talk to her.
Yeah, we're going to actually have this is like the classic rom-com. Things just keep getting in the way of having that serious conversation that they want to have. But she's upset. He is the knight in shining armor. He springs in. How can, have some wine. I like that's his first reaction is,
brandy or something,
can I give you some substance to calm you the hell down?
It works nowadays.
It totally works nowadays. It's always worked.
Okay, but you said how upset Elizabeth was, and that I think part of it was also where she comments there, I who knew who he was, who knew what Wickham was about. So I think part of the reason she's upset as well is that she's taking a little bit of accountability for it.
Right, so for not warning everybody.
Exactly. So I think
everyone has their reasons. The whole, we didn't warn you people about Wickham, I feel that goes right up the chain of command of Pride and Prejudice. It starts with Darcy, who doesn't tell enough people. And then it's the British hush-up factor coming home to bite everyone in the ass. Anyways, Darcy says...
The hush-up works well, though, because that's exactly what they do.
That's what they do,
okay, anyway.
Darcy tells her to, get in the carriage, go back home to be with her family.
He doesn't, though. He just says, oh, you've long...
No, you're right. I've totally got that wrong.
Yeah.
He's like, I'm out of here. And she's like, oh, crap.
Yeah.
He's gone.
Exactly.
You're right. That's an important point.
If I didn't tell him or...
Yeah, she actually... does not interpret. We know, but she doesn't really know that his exit is to go fix her problems. Not, she thinks it's, oh, I've now put my foot in it. We have more association with Wickham.
Right away,
he's leaving me.
I think I might have messed up this.
No, he leaves. He backs out. He's like, oh, he gets all.
No, I know, but does he leave right then?
He does.
I think later on he.
No, he
barks
totally
at
leaves,
Caroline.
and then there's kind of a Darcy in London montage of him doing the detective work. I kind of dug that. You don't get a lot of that in this show. So he's like knocking on doors, and I expected theme music. There was no theme music while he's doing the 70s detective, beating the street kind of thing, talking to people. That's when you see Lydia and Wickham, because Lydia, who treats this whole thing as some grand joke.
Yep.
Like, in her letter, she writes a letter, and she's like, oh, it's so funny what we're doing. Yep. Everything that we're doing is such a great joke. And when she sees Darcy, like, doing his detective work out on the street, she's like, you'll never believe who's down there, looking out. And Mr. Darcy. But this all happens kind of off camera, but Darcy, Gardner, and Bennett basically round up Lydia and Wickham and force them to marry, right?
I don't think Bennett does, because he comes back
he doesn't know.
empty-handed.
He does, yeah.
Oh, that's right, Gardner. Yeah, there's a short. It's not in the book, but they have it in the film. Like, there's actually a scene with the minister in the church, marrying them, and you could see Darcy is present. You can see Gardner is present. You can see, I'm not sure who. That's pretty much it. It's not very well attended. It's we got to do this.
I think you're slipping into the next episode.
No. This is in this episode.
I think this is in this episode. It's difficult, though, because I forget, the Mr. Bennett summation of the entire ordeal. I forget if that's the end of this episode.
That's right. That's the next episode. So, Lydia writes her letter. Elizabeth goes home, brushes her hair, sees Darcy in the magic mirror, which is kind of the clumsiest. We've mentioned a couple of these weird floating head sequences. There's a point where Elizabeth's in her room and she sees Darcy in the mirror. It's kind of goofy. Do you not remember this scene? She's looking in her mirror and then the image of Darcy just takes up. That image did not endear to me. Then Collins comes by to gloat. That's the scene you alluded to earlier. In the book, he just writes a letter. But no. In the series, he gets in his cart and he drives 50 miles, and he comes in ostensibly to comfort, but in classic Collins style. He ends up being kind of like, when you have like what the worst impression of what small churches do, like the gossiping and the judging, Collins kind of embodies that for about 4 solid minutes. And the sisters, all the remaining sisters, the mom is like in her druthers. She's not coming out of her room, Mrs. Bennett. But the three or four sisters.
3 sisters.
4. Mary's there.
Mary is there. Kitty is hiding. She's
Kitty is hiding. You're right.
I'm
Thank
not
you very
spending any
much.
time with him.
You're right. She's hiding behind the corner. They have to sit there and take it. And the most fun in this scene is watching Elizabeth get ready to punch him in the face, and Jane go, no. There's a lot of hands on, hands on her palm, hands on her shoulder. It's an escalating hand. It's really, really good. I
like the conversation a little afterwards between, like, the second big conversation between Elizabeth and Jane, where you get the sense that Jane is kind of the endless optimist and Elizabeth the pessimist, and now it's really to the extreme where Elizabeth is like, there's absolutely no hope for the family. Lydia's doomed us all. We're destitute. This is far worse than anything we ever could have had happen to our family. And Jane is just, maybe they did get married somehow, and maybe somehow they will eventually get married if they're not, and maybe they didn't even fool around or anything like that. And even Mary's like moralizing self-righteousness is amped up a level, and Mrs. Bennett, like everything, all the Bennett females are all cranked to 11 for just a while with Mr. Bennett out of the picture. Not that he in any way
controls, or maybe his self-deprecation adds a levity that isn't there when he's gone.
I don't think so.
But they're all,
I think it's something where Jane and Elizabeth and, I don't know, maybe Mary and Kitty can just kind of vent to him about Mrs. Bennet, and when that vent is absent, then the emotions just kind of blow up.
Yeah, and that's really it with this episode, is it not? Is there anything we're missing?
So I did comment how Elizabeth at first, when she first hears, tries to take some accountability for it because she who knew what Wickham was like, right? And then later on, Mrs. Bennet, when she finds out, oh, I knew all along. I knew what he was like.
Oh, her and her sister,
yeah.
Mrs. Phillips.
I tried to
they
tell
have their
other
little
people,
after the fact
so they
session.
don't. But then Jane, a little later on, she says, oh, Elizabeth, I encourage you not to ruin his character by saying anything. So she tries to take accountability. I just think it's very interesting how people have different reactions to their part or non-part in this. But also Mr. Bennet. This is where Mr. Bennet says, no, for Elizabeth, I do not blame you for what you said earlier in the spring about letting Lydia go. It's shown good foresight. But then he says, no, I should feel this discomfort. Don't worry, it'll pass soon enough, which is very funny from Mr. Bennet. But
yeah,
he starts taking it out on Kitty a bit, right? No, Kitty, you shall never go to a ball until you've proven that you can stand, 10 minutes and...
Another airplane, like a dozen years or so, I'll let you go.
Yeah. Right. And I guess this is Bennett pretty much saying that I haven't done the best that I could have done, but I'm too old to change. Like I don't like as much as Mr. Bennet is high in self-awareness. Mm-hmm. He's not very high in self-empowerment when it comes to changing, which is actually where his daughter Elizabeth is like an improved version of Bennet. She has the self-deprecation, she has the self-awareness, but she also has the wherewithal to understand her faults and make some effort to attempt to correct them. I think that comes out with although Mr. Bennet seems mostly upset that he's going to have to pay his brother back because his brother-in-law picked up
we didn't quite get to that
up the tab of Wickham's debts and the wedding and everything else.
That's the letter that they received just near the end of the episode here, right?
Is that in this episode? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that might have been where they're in the little copse of trees off to the side, and he's like, "Read on." That's in this episode?
Yeah, it's just at the end. Okay. I know I wrote.
Okay, she has notes.
He says that he's too beside himself. So Jane, read it out loud.
Yeah.
Right. Well, in the novel, it's a fairly lengthy letter. Like you read the letter directly. So that whole read on, it's a very funny little bit, all nicely done for the medium of television rather than literature. It actually works. It actually works quite well. And then you've got there's some cutaways and some flashbacks, but basically that settles that. And I'm not sure where the actual freeze frame is in this episode, but it must be right after the letter.
I believe, isn't it? I seem to think it's on Darcy's face for some reason, but I could be very well wrong. Although, is this also the episode where there is kind of like the confession of, well, not confession, but Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet says that he's not been that good of a father.
No. That's next episode. That's a key point in the next episode. Okay. I feel I will agree with what you said at the beginning in that in the race to the end of the series, those last two episodes feel like a super episode. Like it's really hard. I find all the other ones have nice demarcation points between each episode, but this one is a little less clear. Mm-hmm. Also, for the record, if we're done with this episode, we did do a search of terms if you recall at the end of the previous episode, we wanted to know whether there was more uses of the phrase countenance versus the phrase I dare say. And I will have you know, Nat, that you are the winner here. There are 30 uses of the word countenance in the novel and 31 uses of I dare say. So it's by a hair that that your turn of phrase that won out.
I appreciate that. Now what do I win?
I'm not sure. I'm sure you win a nice crocheted pillow with I dare say on it.
Well, that's lovely. I can use that, certainly.
I'm sure they're on eBay.
Get started on that needlepoint right away.
I'm going straight to Etsy.
Don't waste your time on this.